Sounds good.
And I'm just getting the stream set up here and we'll be ready to rock and roll in a second.
Okay. I think as soon as you're ready, Brian, we'll just go and get started. And if you agree, Megan, since we're after 6 now. Okay.
I'm ready to screen share whenever.
Okay. I see live on YouTube. I don't see a recording thing yet.
We don't do a separate recording, so it's housed on YouTube. So the stream goes to YouTube and then we save it on there as well.
Okay, so we're running now then.
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay, Megan, whenever you're ready, then go ahead and take it away.
Thanks for coming tonight or watching the recording of this. This is the Metro District 301 presentation about debt. I am Megan Murphy from the law firm White Bear Inkley, Tanaka and Waldron, and we will get started. Let me screen share the presentation here. Okay, are you able to see that, Randy? Can you see the slides? Okay, great. Thanks for joining me tonight. One of my loyal fans, so appreciate that. So this presentation is going to build on topics that we discussed in the 101 presentation and the 201 presentation. Both of those are available at the link you see on this slide. If you'd like to watch those, I think it's a good idea before we get into talking about debt to have that background. So here's an overview of the presentation. We're going to be talking about how metro districts can issue debt under Colorado law, what needs to happen before they issue debt, who's involved in a debt transaction, types of debt, limits on debt, and then we'll close with an example that I hope articulates some of the concepts we discussed prior to the example. So as an introduction, remember we talked about this in our 101 presentation, a little bit in the 201, that metro districts are authorized by statute to borrow money and incur debt for funding public improvements. Always keep that in mind. It's not private improvements, it's public improvements. So how much debt? Well, it'll be the lesser of their electoral authorization or their service plan authorization. So the authority to issue comes from the service plan, which in Timnath is approved by the town council, and the electoral authorization, that's a Tabor election held under Colorado law. How much you can actually issue, even if you're authorized to issue more, will depend on the market. Who's willing to loan you money at what interest rate and how much money are they willing to loan you? The legal authority for debt comes from a couple of different places. One we talked about already, that's a service plan, again in Timnath approved by the town council. So that has a maximum debt number that goes in the service plan. The Colorado Constitution requires that prior to the issuance of debt, the entity gain voter authorization. That's a Tabor election. That's in two different places in the Constitution. And then the Special District Act, which we talked a lot about in the 101 presentation, also provides some authority for issuing debt and some limits on the types of debt. So prior to issuing debt, say we've gone through the 101 presentation, we've formed our metro district, we have our first board of directors, and we're about to issue debt. So we've got a service plan approved, we've held a Tabor election, we're going to hire a team of specialists to help the metro district issue that. And we're also going to be working with the development entity to make the project creditworthy. What that means is some plan of development that's approved on the private side that they'll be 500 homes or 200 homes and commercial space, whatever the structure of the Metro District or districts is going to be, we'll want that to be continuing alongside with the debt transaction. So people will be enticed to loan the Metro District money to fund those public improvements. Let's talk a little bit about who's involved in a debt transaction. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that perhaps just the developers on the board or just the board is the only people involved in issuing debt. There are quite a number of folks that are helping Metro Districts issue debt, and here are their names and their parties. So what's called the issuer is the Metro District, who is going to be borrowing money and committing to repay it. Like we talked about in the 201 presentation, if you have a multiple district structure with a pledge agreement, there might be a pledging district that's also a party to the transaction. Remember that pledging district enters into an agreement that says to the issuer, I'm going to give you revenue from my mill levy. The provider of funds can be underwriters or investment bankers. This would be people who take this transaction to the municipal bond market. It could also be a lender, such as Compass Bank, Chase Bank, any bank loaning directly to the Metro District or the issuer. A financial advisor or municipal advisor is engaged by the issuer, has the fiduciary duty to the issuer to help them through the debt issuance and decide if this is a good transaction for the Metro District. Remember, like we talked about in the 101 presentation, all board members have a fiduciary duty to the district to engage in transactions that are for the benefit of the taxpayers and residents of the district. And a municipal advisor will help the board make that determination. The trustee or custodian helps make payments on the bonds after the bonds or loan is closed. They're the third party that handles the funds from the issuer to the lender or the bond buyers who've purchased those bonds. More parties, more people involved. Bond counsel. This is a special type of lawyer that is engaged by the issuer that helps craft documents that make sure the obligation to repay the debt is legally enforceable. Disclosure counsel is, again, another lawyer engaged by the issuer that prepares the disclosure document. This is the offering document that goes to the municipal bond market, describing the transaction and describing the Metro District or districts that are part of the transaction. This disclosure document will also include information about the development or development plans that the Metro Districts and the developer might be undertaking. Underwriters counsel, remember the underwriter is the group that's going out to sell these bonds to the market. Their lawyer is engaged to ensure the documents match what they're marketing to municipal bond buyers. General counsel of the issuer, this is what White Bear does. We review documents and make sure the district stays in compliance, but we are not debt issuance specialists like bond counsel, disclosure counsel, underwriters counsel. There'll also be accountants and auditors who prepare financial documents throughout the year, but especially during a debt issuance, they'll prepare forecasts of revenue and other needed financial documents so everyone going into the transaction can know the ability of the Metro District or the issuer to repay the debt. Any questions on these parties? Okay. Next, we're going to talk about different types of debt. Debt is a term of art in Metro District land, so you can have several different types. The first type is bonds. So bonds are municipal bonds. This is the most common issued debt. General obligation or GO bonds are usually a promise from the issuer to repay the bond with property taxes. A revenue bond, this is not very common for Metro Districts, but you might see in other taxing entities, revenue from a specific project such as a water fee to pay for water revenue bonds. The other types of debt include loan agreements and notes. So this might be, instead of going to the bond market, you've entered into a loan agreement with a private bank to borrow money. Reimbursement agreements. These are most often entered into between the Metro District and the development entity who's developing the project. It has the same purpose as bonds and loans. It's a different document and is often subject to annual appropriation. So unlike bonds and loans where the promise to impose the mill levy and repay over the life of the document is enforceable, the reimbursement agreement subject to annual appropriation language means each year the board needs to make a decision whether they have enough revenue to repay this type of debt. You can also have promissory notes that are subject to annual appropriation. This is very similar to a reimbursement agreement and different than a loan agreement with a note or deed of trust, which is not subject to annual appropriation. Are there any questions on the types of debt? Limitations on debt, and boy, there are limitations. So again, remember the first biggest principal limitation is that the debt must be issued for public improvements. So if you have private improvements, you cannot fund them with the Metro District. The revenue to repay the debt will also often be limited. So the model service plan in TIMNIF includes a total debt issuance limitation. That's that number we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. How much debt can you issue? That's the same number. The maximum debt mill levy, so that's going to be the max mill levy you can impose for the payment of debt. TIMNIF has a concept called a maximum aggregate mill levy, which means you must include both your debt and your O&M mill levy under a cap. And there's also a maximum debt mill levy imposition term. In TIMNIF, that term is 40 years on residential property. That means that debt service mill levy, even at the max, can only be imposed for 40 years. So with all of those limitations in mind, the parties helping the issuer issue debt will take a look at all of these things to come up with a transaction that makes sense for the Metro District. So here is maybe the meat of the presentation is a hypothetical example that I hope brings out the concept we've talked in the earlier slides. So in this example, this Metro District exists, it's already been approved, already gone to court, already has a board of directors, everything we talked about in the one-on-one presentation. So the max debt limit in their service plan is $10 million. Then they went to a Tabor election. And in that Tabor election, they've authorized $10 million for street improvements, $10 million for water improvements. The way Tabor is drafted, we vote separate categories of improvements. So each type of public improvement has its own debt question with its own electoral authorization. But remember, like we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, what's the max debt the Metro District can issue? If we just stop here, that's going to be the $10 million under the service plan. So it's not as if the election questions stack and somehow their max debt limit has become 20 million or more. It remains at that 10 million limit because that's what's in their service plan. So in this case, the development entity has put in public improvements, $8 million in street improvements and $2 million in water improvements. The district goes out and is able to hire a great team to issue $10 million in bonds. They're going to take that 10 million, repay the developer for those improvements, and look how their electoral authorization after the debt issuance goes down because they've allocated debt per election category for street and water improvements. Does this slide make sense? Any questions, Randy? Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
what happens in a metro district when it's maxed out? It's borrowed the maximum amount of money and it has the maximum mill levy, and then they have some sort of catastrophic failure. Maybe they have a swimming pool that caves in or something. What do they do?
Great question. Thanks for asking that. So if this was a hypothetical district in the town of Timnit, they would have a maximum debt mill levy, so they could not impose a higher mill levy. There's no way to do that without amending their service plan. They couldn't impose the mill levy for longer, right? So that's the 40-year term in Timnit. So in that specific example, you'd certainly want the Metro District to be ensuring improvements and paying for ongoing operations and maintenance, because it's unlikely they'll be able to issue more debt if they're already imposing their maximum mill levy. Occasionally, on rare occasions, metro districts can be put into receivership. They're not able to pay their obligations. Okay, so in this example, like we just talked about, the metro district has issued bonds for 10 million to reimburse for public improvements of 10 million. They've agreed to impose the 40 mils for debt with a repayment term of 40 years. Remember, we've got both service plan and electoral authority. And then this, I think, gets to Randy's question. Thanks for previewing that. How does that affect the property owners? Great to say you can issue debt, but what does that mean for the bottom line for someone living in that district? So the property owners in the district, they've benefited from those public improvements, the water line, the streets that have come out to their project. In Timnath, and a lot of jurisdictions, they have service plan protection around the total debt issuance, the max mill levy, the max mill levy imposition term. And if the market value of the homes were to decline and 50 mils or 40 mils didn't bring in as much revenue as it did before, that risk is borne by the bondholder or the lender. So the Metro District only agrees to impose the mills for the number of years. If that brings in less revenue, I'm just going to repeat the same thing, that risk is with the bondholders. So the Metro District, absent a service plan amendment, cannot just increase the mill levy because they aren't making their payments. And similarly, not able to increase your mill levy, not able to issue more debt unless you get your service plan amended to increase the total debt issuance limitation. So the following is an example of the first year of debt. How much would a homeowner pay? If the market value of the home increases, the assessed value will increase, which is positive for all of us. Taxes paid as a dollar amount, not as a mill levy, but as a dollar amount, will increase. If you're lucky enough to be in that situation, it's likely that there'll be an opportunity for the Metro District or the issuer to refinance their bonds or pay their bonds off sooner than the 40-year term, depending on the market conditions and what the board wants to do. And again, like we talked about in the last slide, if the market value decreases and there's less property tax from the same 40 mil imposition, the Metro District cannot increase their mill levy, cannot issue more debt if they're at their max debt limit cap. The risk that they're not being repaid on the bonds is with the bondholders or the lender. And here's an example of the property taxes in the first year in this hypothetical debt issuance. Say the home's worth $500,000. The assessed value right now, the assessment ratio is 7.15%, imposing 40 mils for debt. So this homeowner would pay $1,400 to the Metro District in that first year. And remember, this homeowner benefited from $10 million in public improvements. Like we talked about in the 101, one of the benefits of the Metro District is spreading that cost over 40 years. Instead of having everyone pay an upfront increased lot cost, we're having each homeowner pay $1,400 every year over the 40 years. Of course, subject to fluctuation in value, subject to fluctuation in home prices. And that is the end of the Metro District 301 presentation. We've talked about how to issue debt, types of debt, parties to the debt transaction, and then gone through a hypothetical Metro District to show you what it would do as far as property taxes and how it affects homeowners. Happy to answer any questions, comments, go back to any slides. I don't mean to put all the pressure on you, Randy. Go ahead.
If the assessed valuation goes up or more houses are built, can the Metro District lower the mill rate if they can still pay the bonds?
Yes. So most of these transactions, I think you should know going in, what the accountant is doing is forecasting. You know, if there's going to be 500 homes, they're forecasting out 500 homes and increased AB when the bonds are issued. So it's unlikely that something like just more homes being built would lead to a lower mill levy because it's built into the calculation when the debt is originally structured. but say they got it wrong and they guessed too low, like we've been seeing lately, incredible increase in values in homes and number of homes. If they got it wrong, there's a chance that the mill levy could be lowered, yes.
Can the developer buy the bonds?
Yes, so there's all types of what's called institutional investors, which have to meet tests of being, not me, I'll say, meet tests of certain sophistication in the bond market, but developers or developer entities can buy bonds, yes. I think that might be the end of the show, team.
I'll throw a few questions out
Oh,
there.
great. Okay, great.
All right. So are there limitations on a Metro District refinancing their loan? For example, do they have to wait so many years after they get the initial loan before they can refinance?
Great question. So a lot of recent transactions have a 5 or 10-year what's called call protection, which means they cannot be refinanced or called during that period of time. After that period of time expires, there'll be a declining premium. So the first year, the Metro District might need to pay a 3% penalty to refinance, 2% the next year, 1% the following year, a declining premium. We're seeing a lot of activity on refinancing all the time because sometimes the numbers make sense even against the declining premium. And that's the exact reason why Metro Districts hire financial advisors, municipal advisors, to talk the board through the pros and cons of refinancing at each different time under each different scenario. Underwriters, placement agents, lenders, they want to make deals. So they're not always thinking necessarily what's the best deal for the district, but a municipal advisor, financial advisor hired to represent the district can help the board make those decisions.
Okay. So when people refinance their homes, a lot of the times they do it because they've paid down a chunk of principal on their home. And if they refinance, they'll be able to lower their monthly payment. Is that same concept still able to come into play when you refinance your Metro District loan? Could you lower, in our hypothetical district, could you lower your levy from 40 mils to 30 mils or less or something after a refi?
Yeah, certainly possible to lower the mill levy, and I represent a couple projects who have gone through refinancing, able to lower their mill levy. Sometimes, depending on the life of the project, they'd like to keep the mill levy the same and take out new money. It's been 10, 15 years since the park was redone. The board has made decisions to redo the park instead of lowering the mill levy, for example.
A cash out refi is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm skimming through some of the questions we got through on the website there. You mentioned in the presentation, in that rare worst case scenario, Metro District wouldn't be able to pay its bonds; it would go into receivership. Could you explain exactly what that would mean for your individual homeowner?
So from the homeowner's perspective, like we talked about maybe the last 2 or 3 slides, you're protected under this hypothetical service plan, the 40 mils for 4 years. So from your perspective, you're not going to receive an increased property tax statement that says 80 mils, 100 mils. That's not going to happen. But what you will probably see is a reduction in amenities, and probably, if the project is not built out, a reduction in lot sales and future development as the project goes through a rough patch. Sometime before I started doing this, very many moons ago, there used to not be max mill levy caps, and there was this risk that projects would go under and the mill levy could be raised to the roof. Almost every jurisdiction has put in max mill levy caps and max mill levy imposition terms to prevent that risk from being borne by the homeowner.
I haven't thought through this all the way, but would it affect the homeowner's ability to resell their house if their Metro District is in receivership?
Certainly. I think if you were in that type of situation, you would be seeing a lack of lot sales and a lack of amenities. If the district can't make payments, it's unlikely they're operating a pool or clubhouse, unlikely snow removals happening on time. It wouldn't be a good situation. So I definitely don't want to give you that impression. but it isn't as if the Metro District can simply go issue more and more and more and more and more debt to solve this problem, which is why the receiver would come in.
You
Okay.
didn't, that brings up another point. You pretty much focused on debt repayment, but the metro districts have debt and operation. You know, it's divided into two parts.
Yeah, so this presentation was just about debt. I think if we get more community feedback about operations and maintenance and how Councilmember Hanson feels, we might do something about that. But yes, this presentation only focuses on, remember, the whole project is both private and public, and then half of the public is debt and half is operations. So we're in a little quarter piece of pie over here with this one.
All right. Well, thanks, Randy, and I appreciate your questions that you've sent in online, and appreciate you joining us. I appreciate the thought you're giving to the subject. So, I think we had one more individual join. We're actually about to wrap up. So let's see if Mr. Crabtree, if you had any questions about debt. Oh, he dialed off. So, all right. Well, and if that's it, then we'll go ahead and close out.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.